there a risk of product recalls if new products don't comply with the right to repair and its new update?
It's a very interesting question in terms of product recall. So I think when we look at the intended position of the right to repair legislation, it's about enabling consumers essentially to be able to have that right to repair. Now, what it doesn't mean is that a consumer will undertake all of those repairs. So essentially what the legislation is saying is that parts such as motors or pumps would need to be repaired by a professional. Other pieces, perhaps such as seals or gaskets or elements within a particular appliance that can be accessed by a consumer and be repaired by somebody who's got a level of competency, perhaps a kind of DIY skill, then they would be able to do that. So in terms of product recall, I think there are two parts to this. Would the manufacturer themselves make a product recall, or would the products be recalled if the repairs were undertaken incorrectly? So I think on the first one, it's unlikely that it would lead to a product recall. And the principle behind that is that the right to repair really is about designing for the environment. So it has to take a design-led approach. I think the chances of a product recall are therefore very, very slim. The real risks, I think, end up with looking at whether the repairs themselves are undertaken to a high enough standard. My view is that if those repairs are not satisfactory, and we see a lot of products then that are returned as faulty as a result of those repairs being undertaken, there may be a shift in the design principles and how those components are then placed within the appliances themselves. But as it stands, I don't think there's a particularly high risk of a product recall. Frankly, it's one of those things we will have to wait and see over time as the repairs start to take place.
So question 2, is there any future plan for a harmonised labelling on right to repair?
Okay, harmonised labelling. So eco labelling really is what we're talking about here. So currently you have ISO type 1 labels that really cover eco labeling, and so they are designed to tell a consumer really about the performance of a particular good or an appliance. And there are lots of various standards out there for how consumers can understand the performance side of an appliance that they're buying. So I'm not aware of any particular intent to harmonise the labeling. One of the real challenges is making sure that you can get sufficient information in front of the consumer. So if you think about the amount of what you'd call real estate on the label, it's quite cluttered already. So you've got kind of CE type elements in there, you've got product information, you've got barcodes in there. I think it's going to be very difficult to then add, with any real meaning, lots of information around right to repair. There's quite a few challenges out there at the moment in terms of low carbon products. So whilst we can have a traffic light system for energy efficiency and kind of star ratings, I think that's very good. The only way really that this is likely to work, and where there will be some kind of homogenization, if you will, is where the information contained around the performance of the appliance and its rating, if you will, around its repairability would need to be combined into a single label. Now, I think that's quite difficult as a consumer when you're looking at those labels. I think it's very easy for us to understand the performance, whether it happens to be A or AAA rated, for example, is very easy to digest. Trying to put information in there that tells you about its repairability is something quite different, and clearly each appliance is going to be very different. So I think the real challenge is how do you get to that level of information that a consumer can easily digest? Now, I think what is quite exciting are lots of apps and add-ons to e-commerce sites which will lead to a rating of appliances. So not only will they talk about energy efficiency, but they will talk about a sustainability footprint at large. And that to me feels like a position where a consumer could come into an e-commerce site, look to purchase an appliance and then understand more detailed information. And the idea of having that then in a digital environment as opposed to a physical environment, I think is quite encouraging. But it also then enables people to drill down into a lot more information around the repairability of an appliance.
Question 3. How to adapt to the right to repair from a product design perspective?
So adaptation to the RTR legislation is quite interesting. So there are lots of organisations who've taken what's termed a design for environment-led approach. So essentially what we're talking about here is circular economy, making sure that we don't have a take, make, dispose type linear process to one that's far more circular. So the adaptation really comes down to product design. And I guess the best way to describe this is if you were looking at a schematic of an appliance, for example, and you kind of had an exploded view of all those different parts, you'd almost start by saying, well, look, which components of this particular appliance are repairable, are not repairable? What do we need to do to then make those parts repairable? And I think you would then start to break that down into, well, some of those parts, as I said earlier, things like pumps and motors are going to be very difficult to disassemble to regular consumers, and would need to then be built in such a way that a professional can access those. Now we've got to think about product hygiene and safety there as well. So we really don't want people who are untrained accessing fairly essential components within appliances. But those bits that can be easily replaced, it then comes down to not just their ease of replacement. It comes down to how those things are built, and that's more of a supply chain question, and it's more about thinking around the supply chain performance. So, for example, if you look at gaskets and seals, is the rubber that's tapped to make those particular components as sustainable as it can be? So there would be a series of questions, I think, for the manufacturers, the OEMs, to think about in terms of where they're sourcing the raw materials and in the value chain, is that sustainability maintained all the way through the value chain? So the adaptation, I don't think, is necessarily difficult. I mean, when you think about white goods in particular, they are a series of components that are assembled. So it's not necessarily too challenging around an assembly point of view. As I say, I think a lot of this comes down to the upstream side of this. So what are you sourcing? Are you doing that in the most sustainable way? And are you building it with longevity? So the idea behind the right to repair legislation is that most white goods appliances should have at least a 10-year life, and be able to replace clearly as much as you can within the item. So when you think about longevity, it's also an issue over quality, making sure that those components are of the highest quality, will last as long as possible. And where they do fail, and inevitably they will fail, you are able to extract them and replace them as easily as possible. So I don't see it as being particularly challenging for most organizations to adapt. It will require some adaptation in terms of behavior change and philosophies. To build philosophies, I guess, is the way to best describe that. So hopefully not too challenging.
Can you share an example of how right to repair from product design has a positive impact in terms of sustainability?
Yes, I think there are lots of examples in terms of how product design is beneficial for sustainability. But the point I would make is that actually lots of sectors and lots of companies have been doing this for quite some time. So we've come to a point where, I guess if we go back sort of 70, 80 years ago, lots of things were designed to be repaired. We have then created global economies, which is very much about take, make, and dispose. So the automotive sector, for example, spent a lot of time not really thinking about recycling, not really thinking about circular economy, but actually in the early part of this century, there was quite a lot of legislation that drove automotive manufacturers to think about recyclability within their vehicles, understanding more that consumer patterns were actually we're not going to keep a car for 20 years. We're probably going to keep a car for 5 or 6 years, and rather than just crushing the vehicle and ending up with lots of toxic waste and non-recyclable waste and large percentages of it ending up in landfill, the idea was again being able to break apart that particular vehicle into its component parts, and then also thinking about things such as industrial symbiosis. So where you've got toxic materials, perhaps flammable materials, they're permeated with chemicals, how could that then be repurposed for other people, not necessarily in the same industry vertical, but across different verticals? So I think automotive's done a really great job. There's also aviation, again, equally creates a very good secondary market. So it's quite often the bit we don't think about. We jump on a jet plane, we travel across the world. These are highly complex machines with millions of components. They will end up somewhere in a breaking yard somewhere. But actually, what happens is if you build the appliances or the pieces of equipment with quite high value components, then that secondary market already exists. And I think that's kind of what we need to get to with the right to repair legislation. Is you go back to that previous question around the adaptation. If there are high quality components in an appliance, then the secondary market already exists, because it's inevitable that it's going to fail in one appliance somewhere along the line. So being able to access that secondary market is a huge benefit. I mean, I think there are lots of examples. I guess you could even go right down to the apparel sector. So there are lots of platforms now where we're taking clothes, we're almost leasing clothes in some, or in fact there are platforms where you can lease clothes, but it's about actually moving that particular item on to someone else. And when it comes to environmental benefit, really what we're trying to avoid is any long-term impact when it comes to end of use. We want the use to be as long as possible.
Do you think that the right to repair can bring more complexity to the EU-UK electronics trading market?
It's a good question around complexities and trading. I think it's highly likely that we'll see more complexity and a greater administrative burden in the market. Will certainly require a lot more paperwork to be complete. However, I think what's really important is that we need to think about complexities not just in terms of the transactions, but also in the tracking of usage. So clearly, what will be really important is to understand the effectiveness of this piece of legislation. So it can't simply be a case that goods are imported, end up with distributors, and then of course retailers, and in the hands of consumers, without some way of tracking the repairs that go on with a particular appliance, and I think by types of appliances as well. There are, I guess, there will be more of a challenge for importers in making sure that they are adhering to the legislation, and I think there's a kind of circular part to this as well. As I said, where consumers are then interacting with appliance, perhaps a product in ways that they wouldn't have done previously. We need to ensure that information is captured, and that requires us then really to interact with that secondary market that we've been talking about. So where components are made available and then are purchased either by professional repairers or by consumers themselves, we're going to have more complexity there, because we're going to be importing the finished good, but we're also then of course going to need to make sure that we've got access and availability to all of those components that we can then make available for repair. So that in itself, I think, is going to introduce more complexities. And again, going back to the original question around product recall, again, we're going to need to make sure that we track very carefully which parts of a particular appliance have been replaced and by whom. Are they certified? And if they're not certified, who was that work carried out by? So yeah, look, I think it could make it more complex, although a lot of that can be mitigated at the early stages by making sure that we have, as far as possible, the correct documentation with each of those, which you would fully expect with each of the components that are inbound, and I think as well a really clear categorization as well, not necessarily a taxonomy, I don't think, but a categorization, so that we can again make sure that we very consistently trace and track. I think we were talking about track and trace of the component parts, weren't we? It's been a pleasure talking to everyone, and thank you very much to HQTS for inviting me to add further comment to this very interesting topic area.